Hey everyone, it's Jakov, and I'm here today with a new video to break down the update that Total War The Dawnless Days has received. As I've said in the past couple of videos, over the Christmas season, I've been recovering from a surgery that took my voice, which is why I'm late to making this update. If you're new here, The Dawnless Days is a mod for Total War Attila that overhauls the game and sets it in the Third Age of Middle-earth, the mod having just released a version 0.6.5 alpha. It's a mod that I very much recommend and I'm going to leave linked in the description. Because a significant amount of content was added in the newest update, I'm going to be breaking down the update into two parts. The first covering the smaller changes to the mod, like a unit or two being added to a faction or a unit's weapon changing, not really big enough to warrant their own individual videos, so better done as a collection. The second video will be covering the faction and roster of Lothlorien that has just been added as of this update. With all that said, we'll begin by mentioning that a new historical battle, that is a scenario made by the mod creators, has been made, this being the Battle of the Fords of Isen. This one being meant to be the first, I believe, as there were two battles in this area. Still, it's always great to see these battles being added as they allow you to live out the wars of Middle-earth. Let's get into it, started with the first faction to see a change, albeit a minor one, Everball, and the change of its Onager crew members. Before, they were equipped the same as the other professional Everball troops in their heavy plate armour. Now the artillerymen are equipped like the Iron Hill crossbows, which makes more sense, given that typically your support troops wouldn't be as heavily armoured as your frontline infantry. Definitely a nice little change to see. Moving on to Gondor, this faction has seen several changes occur, the first of these being that the Fountain Guards, one of the elite units of the faction that can also serve as a general unit, has changed roles, going from a pike unit to a polearm unit, its weapon becoming a long spear now. Personally, I'm a massive fan of this, as I never really liked the Fountain Guard being pikemen in the mod. It was something that didn't really fit their role as guardsmen, as well as the fact that as pikemen, they were somewhat weaker than the lesser units fielded by other factions, due to being unable to be amassed in large numbers. Turning them into a polearm unit makes a lot of sense, although it now means that my rankings of both the polearm units and the pike units in the mod are in need of revision. Gondor now completely not fielding any pikemen, although if the new pikeman of Ithilien unit we've been teased becomes a reality, that'll change. The next unit to see a change are the Knights of the Silver Swan, who have had their design updated, the unit being more uniform now in appearance. Now, every man in the unit has a shield which is painted with the exact same emblem of the Swan of Dol Amroth, compared to before, where ships were often seen. Their horses' comparison now all being dark blue, turquoise and sky blue being common colours before. The horses of the unit are now more heavily armoured, having gilded patrals, the plate that wraps around a horse's chest and protects it. Apart from that, the rest of the horse armour is more ornate, the gilded chanfrons covering the face looking far more impressive, as do the gilded criniers covering the upper neck, making for a more elite looking unit, with riders too now wearing more ornate armour with gilding and engraving, the swans atop their helmets being wrought of gold with silver wings, attesting to the unit's wealth. Overall, a fantastic redesign and a sign of things to come, with a Gondor overhaul sometime in the future. Lastly, for Gondor, the faction has had a new unit added, the Prince's Sergeants, mounted warriors hailing from Dol Amroth and another sign of Gondor's fiefdom system. A Silver Tier 2 heavy shock cavalry unit, these are the supporting warriors for the Knights of the Silver Swan, much in the same way as the Prince's Coast Guard, who these guys resemble, essentially being that unit on horseback. Looking more closely at the men, they ride mostly unarmoured horses, the horses' heads being protected by basic iron chanfrons that look a world apart from the gilded artwork the knights have access to. The riders wear a more ordinary standard Gondorian helmet with slight gilding to indicate the Swan of Dol Amroth, and engravings to symbolise the feathered helmets of ancient Numenor and Gondor, these helmets resembling the Ottoman acorn-style helmets of medieval barbutes, a male standard being worn with the helmet to protect the throat. For their torsos, the men wear a mix of tunics emblazoned with the white swan, turquoise, sky blue, and dark blue all being seen. Over their upper chest, the men appear to wear oversized gilded gorget, which doesn't make sense given that normally gorgets were worn underneath the upper part of a breastplate to stop weapons from reaching the neck, not worn over the top of surcoats or tunics by themselves, but it does provide some additional protection, which is something. Apart from that, the only armour they've got are van braces for their forearms, leather gloves for their hands, and greaves and pollens for their shins and knees, leather riding boots topping off the look. The men use older shields that mostly resemble kite shields, except with partially straight sides, these shields having emblems of ships and swans mixed on them, as well as being turquoise or different shades of blue. This unit seems to have taken the variations in colour and heraldry that the previous version of the Knights of Dol Amroth possessed, which is good because it means the modders are reusing assets instead of wasting them. For use in conjunction with these shields, the men have what I can't describe as lances and more as spears, spears. The somewhat standard Gondorian spear with a very long and skinny head with a small diamond section in the blade. This Naginata-like weapon being good at stabbing and slashing. A cool weapon that also sees use by the Gondor cavalry, but is very different to the actual lances used by the Knights of the Silver Swan. Sharing an almost identical officer to the Knights of the Silver Swan, this officer lacks a helmet, which is a big no-no. Helmets keep you safe in battle and are the most important bit of armor. Protecting his chest, he has an ornately decorated breastplate with leaves and swans engraved into it, with a gilded gorget over the top, by same complaint as before standing, underneath all that being either an arming shirt with mail sleeves or a mail shirt. Attached to his breastplate are decorated folds which cover his upper legs, while his lower legs lie in greaves and pollens for defence, his upper arms having gilded pauldrons, spolders, the aforementioned mail sleeves, and van braces, his hands only having leather gloves rather than gauntlets. Carrying the same shield as his men, but in better condition and with metal rimming the top and bottom, in the style of the shields used by the Knights of the Silver Swan, while for a weapon he has an arming sword with an upswept gilded hilt to show off his wealth. As a unit, these guys, despite being limited to a max of 3 per army, are highly useful for Gondor as they give the faction much needed mobility, meaning you can hit the enemy more easily than you could before with hammer and anvil strikes. Slightly weaker than the Gondor cavalry, this unit is still a boon to any Gondorian general, offering you more flexibility and firepower, which is appreciated. Not the most game-changing unit, all things considered, but definitely a welcome surprise given I had no clue this unit was coming until the mod dropped. Turning to the next faction to see changes, we have Imladris, which for such a small faction with a limited roster, looks quite different to before. To begin with, the Guards of Imladris, which had been a silver tier 3 heavy pike infantry unit, with a max limit of 3 units per army, and the ability to serve as a faction general, has been reworked, now being a gold tier 4 very heavy melee infantry unit. Just as before, the unit can serve as a general to the faction, being one of 2 available for Imladris. In terms of armor and equipment, the unit looks almost identical, using the exact same elven armor as before with partial gilding and leather accents, the main change being that the troops have dropped their pikes and picked up swords and shields. The shields being the standard wood covered in metal shields used by the elves, which resemble kite shields crossed with Boshan shields with their cutouts, these shields being bossed and enamelled in a dark red close to burgundy, this being the colour associated with the faction. In conjunction with these iconic styled shields, the guards from Imladris use swords that can only really be called sabres, the weapons resembling sabres used by European cavalry of the early modern period, and shashkas, the traditional swords of the Cossacks. Lacking crossguard, which is a historical feature of shashkas, and having small spikes on the blade designed to deflect enemy weapons, the swords overall look almost identical to the sword used by Elrond in the Lord of the Rings and Hobbits films, Hadafang. While such a sword could see service in melee combat, the truth is weapons of these style are best suited for use on horseback, cutting downwards into enemies fleeing from you, rather than in a clash of shield wars. Moving on, while the officer wears the same armour, his equipment too was changed, as his previous version used the same sword as his men in conjunction with their shields. Now, however, he wields a two-handed sword with a long hilt and broad blade, reminiscent of the ancient Dacian falxes and rampire, large bladed weapons initially developed from sickles that were used by the native warriors of Dacia to devastating effect when fighting the Romans, the weapons being feared for their ability to easily cleave off limbs. In the mod, this style of weapon is often used by elven warriors, specifically shock infantry, and is seen used in the Peter Jackson films multiple times. Overall, a devastating weapon to put in the hands of a veteran warrior like this elven officer. As a whole, with this change, the Guards of Imladris have generally become a far more useful unit with wider-ranging applications on the battlefield. To begin with, they now give your army an elite reserve force of infantry who can go toe-to-toe with any other infantry unit in the mod more or less, easily able to withstand ranged attacks that their pike version would crumble to. True, they aren't as deadly as they were previously to cavalry, and somewhat can't defend gaps in the same way pikes can, but overall they can now hit the enemy far harder and faster, and endure worse damage without breaking. The unit far more capable of serving in the role of general, now as you don't have to worry about having a general who can very easily be sniped, and which is very vulnerable to rapid changes and developments on the battlefield. Overall a useful unit, which even though intended to be limited to 3, can be boosted up to 4 per army if you choose the next unit to lead the Imladris roster, Elrond, leading the Guards of Imladris. A new unique hero general unit added to the mod. Elrond is the Lord of Imladris and one of the mightiest elven warriors in Middle-earth, wielder of Vilya, one of the 3 elven rings of power, and the most powerful, meaning that of all the rings made by Sauron and the elves, it was second only to the One Ring. A minor thing that would be cool to see in future updates would be Elrond wearing his ring, just as a nod to the lore. A veteran of countless wars against Sauron and his supporters, Elrond looks great, but for one thing, his lack of a helmet, which you'd expect a warrior with over 3,000 years of experience to wear. Jokes aside, He doesn't wear his helmet to distinguish him from his troops, and to show off the great modelling done by the mod creators, Elrond instead choosing to wear a silver circlet on his brow, which still helps identify him but offers no protection. For the rest of his body, Elrond wears amazing blood-coloured armour in the same overlaying pattern as the other elves, his being decorated with silver to help set him apart and make for a nice deep red and silver aesthetic, wearing red robes and pants underneath his armour. I'm pretty sure this outfit is based off of what he wears in The Hobbit, the Battle of Five Armies film, during the White Council's raid on Dol Guldur against the Necromancer, although due to the saturation of the film, his armour looks more orange in that. Overall, his armour somewhat brings to mind the banded lorica segmentata worn by the Romans, but also the King's Guard armour worn in the House of the Dragon TV show. Apart from his unarmoured hands, which only have leather gloves to protect him, Elrond is distinguished from his men by his red cloak compared to their silver and blue ones, and his weapon, discarding a shield and sword to instead use the same falk sword as the regular guards of Imladris officer. In my opinion, this was the perfect time to give him Hadafang as a weapon, but the falk's works too, given he passes on his sword to his daughter Arwen, meaning he'll be using a new weapon afterwards. Skipping the regular elves in the unit as they're equipped identically to the regular version of the guards of Imladris, this unit, while possessing the same stats as the guards of Imladris, is an improvement in one massive way. If you use Elrond as general, you can recruit an additional 3 units of guards of Imladris, rather than having 1 as your general and then 2 more added to your army. While being able to squeeze out an extra powerful unit to your army is a good thing at the best of times, given the Imladris roster is so bare of units, any additional power is massively appreciated. It's for this reason that I'd say when playing as this faction, the only correct choice to make as general is Elrond. Finally, the last change made to the Imladris roster was made with the removal of the guards of Imladris' pikemen in mind, and is the addition of a new unit, the Noldorin pikemen meant to replace them. Wearing the same armour as the guards of Imladris but without as much extensive gilding or mail beneath their banded armour, or leather strips attached to their robes, these men lack shields and instead use pikes as their main weapon. My issue with their pikes is that they have a massive blade at the end of them in the same style as the elven sabres, even having little spikes to catch blades. Essentially, these weapons are now pike-length naganadas, which are a massively impractical weapon, as such a heavy pike it would destroy the balance of the weapon and massively increase the risk of the shaft breaking, pikes historically having as small a head as possible so as to reduce strain on the pikeman and the pike itself. Maybe in universe the explanation is that because the elves are known for their considerable strength, such a weapon isn't hard for them to use, and that the wood used by the elves has been strengthened with magic, but realistically, such a pike would be almost unusable. Skipping their standard sword and shield officer, this unit is a great one to see added into the mod, as they fill the gap left by the guards of Imladris, even being the same silver tier 3 heavy pike infantry. While not a potential general unit the way the previous pike unit was, these guys are honestly better due to one major thing, the lack of a limit on recruitment. This means that these guys can be gathered en masse as the core of your army, something that wasn't possible before, and which is very valuable given the limited units available in the Imladris roster. Given it's in such a state, any flexibility on the battlefield when it comes to strategy is crucial, these guys making up the core of your battle line, given that the only other infantry the faction can rely on is shock infantry. Overall, a useful unit, although once the faction roster expands, I figure these guys will be nowhere near as critical. Turning to the next faction, Isengard. The only change they've really seen is a new limit being placed on the White Hand Grenadiers. Instead of having a max deployable number of 3, can only field 1 per army. This means that using them as shock troops to blow holes in enemy armies is much more difficult, and that now you'll have to be more selective in how you choose to use them, as you've only really got 1 shot with them. Overall, I'd say this change balances the faction, given that the Grenadiers could cause the course of a battle to change almost instantly when used together. The next faction to see significant changes is Lindon, which received 3 new units to its roster. The first of these new units are the Haven Watchers. As a unit, these elves are the troops assigned to defend the havens of the elves, the shipyards where they depart for Valinor, the light equipment being explained by the fact that these are garrison units in the heartlands of the elves, arguably the safest places in Middle-earth compared to being on the front lines. Mostly unarmoured bowmen wearing blue and gold tunics over leather vests. These elves have leather braces over their forearms to protect them from their bowstrings slapping their forearm, leather boots giving their legs minor protection. While I'd normally criticise warriors, including archers for lacking helmets, given these troops almost entirely lack armour with the exception of leather jerkins that are less armour and more clothes worn for hunting, I can't really call out the unit as being poorly equipped, although again, helmets would be nice to see, wearing basic brown cloaks and appearing to lack any weapon at their side in case of melee, although they probably have daggers. Their main weapons are beautifully gilded longbows, the accompanying quivers being slung over their back. Longbows were a widely used weapon in England and Wales by the peasantry in the high to late Middle Ages. While it seems wrong to call these elves peasants, it's cool to see this weapon in the hands of warriors of this lower class compared to their Noldorin brethren. Looking at the unit officer, he wears the same outfit as his men, although he has a circlet on his head to indicate his rank, similar to Elrond in the Imladris roster, which makes sense given Imladris was founded as a client state of Lindon, Elrond serving in Lindon for millennia before establishing his own land. Apart from his circlet, the officer is distinguished by his shield, which is made of carved wood, rimmed and embossed in bronze, the shield resembling ancient Greek Boeotian shields, with the cutouts in the side and ancient Celtic shields, the shield being a nice change from the kite-inspired shields covered in metal normally used by the elves. Used in combination with the shield, the officer has a sword lacking a crossguard, the sword resembling somewhat a cavalry saber crossed with a katana, which is an interesting mix to see, the sword very much having a look similar to Hadafang and the sword used by the elves of Imladris, but less fancy, reflecting the lower status of the unit. Speaking of the unit, this is a massively important one, as it reflects the first early game unit added to the Lindon roster, opening up different types of army builds. Obviously this unit is your starting archer in the early game, being a core building block of your armies, having fantastic range for bronze tier 1 light bow infantry, being more than capable of beating the early game archers you're expected to face, and being useful even against mid game units, although they'll have to do that until more units are added to the faction. A sign of good things to come, these aren't the only early game unit you get, as the Philathrim Seafarers have also been added. The Philathrim are the Elves of the Sea, the elves who build the ships that transport the elves of the Undying Lands, these troops as their name suggests also serving aboard ships as marines. Wearing the same robes, leather jerkins, braces and boots as the previous unit, these elves wear what I think are meant to be either leather or bronze helmets in the style of Anglo-Saxon helmets with cheek guards. If the helmets are leather helmets were worn by lesser infantry, although we have little in the way of existing leather helmets, with the parts of the helmet that are definitely metal, meant to provide rigidity and shape to the helmet, if made of leather. If not made of leather, the helmet is just bronze, which as far as I know wasn't used by the Anglo-Saxons who used iron, or might potentially be bronze covered in a layer of decorated leather, which would be pretty cool to see. Whatever it is, I really want you guys to give your opinions in the comments and let me know what you think. I'm also hoping the modders might comment too and clear it up. Turning away from their helmet of questionable materials, the troops have the same shield as the previous unit's officer, with the same sword too at their side. Their main weapon, however, appears to be the javelins they carry, skirmishing being as ancient as warfare itself, these elves throwing at their enemies on land before engaging with swords or attempting to clear the decks of enemy ships before boarding, the shield providing protection from return fire or enemy melee weapons, which is highly useful given how lightly equipped they are. Skipping the unit officer identical to the previous one, these bronze tier 1 medium skirmishers are for all intents and purposes your early game line infantry the way I see it for now, the unit acting as Roman legionaries essentially, using up their javelins before getting stuck in with their swords. True, the unit is only really viable against rabble infantry and other starting units, but given that's all it has to fight, the unit should do pretty well as your main infantry in the early game, unless regular swordsmen and spearmen are added. Working well in conjunction with the previous unit for early armies, I'd say this unit honestly has more longevity, as even in mid to late game armies you can use these guys skirmishers and support troops. The Haven Watch has been completely outclassed by the Noldorin archers, something that doesn't quite happen to these guys. Moving on to the final unit added to Lindon, we have the Lindon Scouts, riding unarmoured horses, all of which are white. These troops, which are equipped identically to the Philathrim Seafarers, lack shields and seemingly swords and are instead using recurve bows. Recurve bows are the perfect weapon for use on horseback as their compact size and great power makes them far more viable than longbows. Recurve bows being used by the greatest horse archers of history, such as the Huns, the Mongols and the Cumans. Seeing this weapon here then makes a lot of sense, skipping the mounted officer who uses a sword and shield. In battle, these bronze tier 1 light bow cavalry are your mounted archers in the early game, harassing enemy infantry and cavalry at range but avoiding engaging in melee, weakening enemy formation so your dedicated archers and infantry can polish them off more easily. A dangerous unit, while I'd advise keeping them away from spearmen and shock infantry. Foot archers, which normally outrange cavalry archers, don't in this case, which means you can pound away at the enemy bowmen without too much worry. Once they're done with their arrows, these guys should be used to hit the rear of enemy infantry formations with charges, as while they aren't remotely close to as devastating as shock cavalry, they can still cause damage if you cycle charge them. Overall, a nice unit to round out Lindon with, although I can't wait for the faction to be fully expanded, these 3 units giving the faction options that it was sorely lacking. Turning to the final faction to see changes made to its roster, we have yet another elven one, the Woodland Realm. To begin with, 4 new units have been added to the faction, the first of these being the Forest Sentinels. For starters, these elves wear helmets that resemble bassinets, the helmets seeming to be either bronze or burnished steel meant to look like bronze, a central ridge spike on the brow I'm guessing for strengthening of the helmet, which also acts as a nasal bar. the helmet also having two blade-like adornments to the side. While flat-bladed wings are a design feature of the faction as a whole, these are the most egregious as they give your enemy handholds with which to grapple and add extra weight to the helmet. Honestly, without the side attachment, the helmet would look pretty nice, but alas, it is what it is. Turning to the rest of their armour, the elves wear a mix of scale shirts and leather jerkins made of overlapping layers, a leather coat decorated with gold worn over the top, pants being worn for the legs, with a leather skirt over the top for added protection, leather boots covering their feet. The wearing of a buff coat over armour was something that was done during the 17th century, so it's nice to see a different type of costume being worn by the units in the mod, though it should be said that the coats were worn over breastplates, not scale shirts, and definitely not over those leather jerkins that look like a fantasy creation and not historical equipment. In addition to this armour, the elves also have styled pauldrons, spolders and vambraces made of the same bronze or bronze-looking material, leather gloves being worn for their hands. Lacking a shield, these men instead wield massive axes with shafts banded with metal for strength, a nice historical touch. The axes themselves resemble bardishas, the axe blade turning to a large spike at the front, which is good for stabbing enemies and will be useful at fending off horses. Most of the metal in the blade is cut out, making for an axe which is decorated in a very cool manner, but which seems like it would be compromised in battle. While it is true that there were weapons with cutouts in them historically, like some spears, partisans and halberds, normally these tended to be in ceremonial weapons or weapons used by troops not likely to see sustained combat, like royal bodyguards. Definitely a cool weapon that reflects the fashion's more brutal aesthetic compared to the other elves, but one which is lacking in the history and functionality department. Looking at the unit officer, he lacks a helmet, which is a rookie mistake, and instead wears a circlet to identify him. This seeming to be the insignia of rank for elves. Wearing the same armour as his troops, the officer is distinguished by his dark green cloak and his weapon, wielding a brutal two-handed sword lacking a crossguard, with a beautifully carved wooden hilt inlaid with metal for support. Overall, the thick-bladed weapon also resembles a falx or a vampire, being the Woodland Realm take on the similar weapons used by the other elven factions, being chunkier and a bit less refined. Still a weapon that looks more than capable of hacking off limbs or decapitating a horse with ease. Turning to the unit role, these silver tier 2 light shock infantry are your mid-game shock infantry, being the offensive arm of your forces who carve a path through enemy forces, given that the faction seems to intentionally lack a mid-tier swordsman unit, meaning you have to rely on these guys to be your hammer, something they seem suited for, more than making a mess of the units they're expected to face. Turning to the anvil that works in combination with these troops, we have the forest spears. The spear equivalent to the previous unit, they wear the same armour, although these troops choose to use round shields with a bronze rim and boss. The shields also being partially decorated with bronze, the shield meant to look like an autumn tree. Round shields with metal rims were widely used during the early Middle Ages in Europe, and further afield in the Middle East into the early modern period, these shields resembling the ornate shields made by the Persians and the Arabs during the high to late Middle Ages. In conjunction with their shields, the elves used spears with a large decorated head with cutouts in it. My same criticism as before applying here. These spears at least seem to have a lot less of their tips cut out, making them stronger and more functional, although I still say this spear looks like it would be used by a royal guardsman in the 16th and 17th centuries. Skipping the officer, these troops in mid-game silver tier 2 medium spear infantry will make up the core of your army, working very well in conjunction with the forest sentinels, the unit due to its elven heritage being very useful even in late game armies as a support unit, being able to somewhat fight up-tiered enemies. Overall, a unit that I'd very much recommend getting in significant numbers for your armies. Moving on to the next unit, we have the Gate Wardens. Armoured far more heavily than the previous units, these guys are identical to the Hall Guardians in terms of armour, wearing the same ornate helmets with massive crests, veils, and attached leather strips to protect the neck. For their torsos, they wear an ornate tabard over which they have a long-scale hauberk, a buff coat of green leather being worn over that, and the same pauldrons, spolders, and vambraces as the previous unit being worn, but in greenish bronze. Greaves in the same style protecting their shins, while leather boots and green cloaks finish off the look. For shields, the elves use the same somewhat kite shield-shaped shield as the tier 3 spearmen of the faction, being made of wood rimmed with bronze and bossed with a large piece that extends to the sides of the top that is ornately decorated, the shield in general having the aesthetic of bark or a walnut. At their side, the elves have heavy-bladed swords that look like talwars, or their main weapons are the same spears seen before. Looking at the officer, he lacks a helmet and wears a green, partially gilded breastplate over his scale and buff coat. The same sword as his men at his side, while in his hands he has a similar two-handed sword to the previous officers, but with cutouts in the blade, his sword looking to be thicker too, and having a more upturned edge, which would make for a devastating slashing weapon, as well as a good point with which to hook people around. a gold tier 4 very heavy spear infantry unit. These guys have a recruitment limit of 3 per army, which more or less makes them the spear tip of your army, which is fair given that an entire army of these guys would be next to impossible to beat. While it is true that this unit is very useful as a reserve unit to plug up gaps in the line or as the core of your battle formation, it's even more flexible than that given the unit can serve as faction general for the Woodland Realm. True, this means you can only really field 2 in your army without risking a general, but it means you can get one of the toughest generals in the mod, more than capable of enduring heavy combat and enemy range attacks that would break the other generals available to the faction. Overall, a unit I'd more than recommend including in your armies to stiffen their backbone, and which I'd heavily consider using as a general. Turning to the final unit added to the faction, we have the Forest Archers, wearing the same armour as the Forest Spears and having thick-bladed Tarwar-style blades at their side, their main weapons being the longbows that they wield. Such a weapon makes a lot of sense for elves given their natural affinity with the bow, even more so when you remember one of the greatest archers of the Third Age, Legolas, hailed from the Woodland Realm. Skipping their standard officer, these are your silver tier 2 light bow infantry, who provide your mid-game forces with range support. Due to their elven heritage, these guys have great range and can compete with some of the lesser tier 3 archers, being that useful. I suggest plentiful amounts of these guys in your mid-game armies, given that the troops available at such a point are pretty far and few between, so you have to maximise what you have available, and these guys are a very good unit to have available. With these guys covered, the last of the new units added to the mod have been looked at, however one more change has occurred to the Woodland Realm roster. That would be the crew of the Onagers, who were previously as equipped as tier 3 infantry, but now wear the lighter equipment of the mid-game units, specifically the Forest Archers, although some in the unit lack helmets, which makes sense given that these are support troops. There's no reason for them to be equipped as heavy infantry, although uniform helmets would be nice. With these dudes covered, all the changes in the mod that I meant to talk about have been looked at, so let's move on to the end of the video. Overall, this update has done a good job in fleshing out some of the most underdeveloped factions in the mod, which is great, although more content is needed before they're up to the level of the fully functioning factions. The balancing and changes added to have also made for a richer gaming experience, so that's to be appreciated. All I can say is that it was a nice Christmas present to receive from the modders. While this video may be done, I haven't forgotten that an entirely new faction, Lothlorien, has been added, so that'll be the next video coming up. If you guys have enjoyed this, please like and subscribe. I know it may not seem like much, but for such a small channel, it's massively appreciated. With all that said, this is your host Jakov, signing out.